I'm so alone. Okay. So this is the first video that you're going to watch for Wednesday's class. The date's going to be 3/15. This is really quick about water, so chemistry and a little bit of biology, and the goal is to keep it as short as possible. We've talked about this before in the last set of slides. Water is super integral to life. We are made up of it. It exists everywhere, and its properties are super special, which why it is so prevalent. Most of our cells are surrounded by water. Cells themselves are 70 to 90% water, and all living things are made up of cells. Therefore, we're made up of water. The reason that Earth is so livable is because of the water. Other planets, we can't live on them mostly because of the water or the lack thereof. Water has 4 properties that you really should know. Think about the essay question that we did on Monday. Water's ability to be cohesive, so attract itself to other water molecules, and adhesive, which is attracting other polar molecules. Think about transpiration in plants. Water's ability to moderate temperature, which would be boiling point and melting point. It requires a ton of energy. Water's expansion upon freezing, and water's ability to be a really good solvent. All 4 of these things would have been really useful, and you can see that on the board. This was the essay question that we talked about in class. They would have been super useful for that. First property, cohesion and adhesion. Cohesion, they stick together or to each other. This is due to that dipole moment, or partial positive, partial negative. Adhesion, it sticks to other things that have a charge because, similar to a magnet, they are attracted to those things. When we have cohesion, we also have surface tension caused by those dipole moments forming hydrogen bonds, and this is useful when we think about like water's properties, but it's really useful when we think about transpiration because water can move against gravity up towards the leaves of a plant. Second property, moderating temperature. Water has high heat capacity, which means I can put a lot of heat into the water. Think about like a boiling pot of water without it changing very much. It requires a ton of energy to change water even 1 degree, which is why it takes so long for something to boil. This means that it's a good thermoregulator. And in that essay question, we talked about thermoregulation in endotherms, people who regulate their own temperature. It is really useful for us because I need to stay at a normal temperature or else my proteins will denature. My brain will basically melt. This is caused by hydrogen bonding. Hydrogen bonds require a ton of energy to break, so boiling is actually those bonds breaking and the molecules escaping as vapor, and it requires a ton of energy to do that. If you've ever tried to boil a huge pot of water, not like your average size, but like big ones, it takes a really long time. This also means that the water vapor in the air can absorb a lot of heat. Large bodies of water can absorb a lot of heat. So for example, coastal areas, so like we live in a coastal area, we are considered to be thermoregulated by the ocean, which means we don't see as drastic a change in temperature. When it is freezing cold in Central Mass, where my parents live, it's still cold in Marblehead, where I live, but it's not as cold because the ocean has kind of held on to some of the heat throughout the sunny days. Ocean is considered a thermoregulator. So this also means that water's high specific heat is because of the hydrogen bonds, and this minimizes temperature fluctuation within our bodies, within animals, plants' bodies, and that's necessary. But it can also be useful once we see that change. The vaporization, right, water that is sweat becoming vapor, allows us to cool off. It basically takes that heat with it. We have something called evaporative cooling, which means when I'm sweating, I am cooling off because things are becoming vapor. It stabilizes my temperature and it releases the heat somewhere else. Third property that you need to know is that water expands when it freezes. This is because we go from things that are constantly moving and very tightly packed to bonds that become a crystalline structure. So it becomes a very geometric structure and it expands. This is why if the water in your pipes ever freeze, they can burst because water expands. It's why if you put a container of like soda or something that has water in it in the freezer, it can potentially expand a ton, explode sometimes. This is also why ice floats in water. It's the same compound, right? Water and water, but the density is less in ice because the molecules are more spread out. This is great because we need icebergs to float. Also why water or ice forms in a layer on the top of the water in a pond or something like that, and the water beneath it will stay liquid for as long as it can. If it's not very deep, it might freeze the whole way, but very rarely does a full body of water freeze. Again, looking at the left image is going to be your geometric frozen shape. Your right is going to be your water, very fluid form. The last property that you need to know is that water is highly versatile as a solvent. If you think back to the first set of slides, we talked about how anything that's also polar covalent, so ammonia, it's going to dissolve because those charges will pull apart the other compound. So the charges of water pull apart the molecules or the atoms of a ammonia atom or something like that. Words to remember, but not super important. Solution is homogeneous mixture of two substances. The solvent is the dissolver, usually water. The solute is what's being dissolved, usually something we put in water. And an aqueous solution is one which water is the solvent, which is a lot of, especially in chemistry, we mix a lot of things with water. Water is super versatile because of the hydrogen bonds and because of that dipole moment. Other charges respond to something that's charged. So even the ionic bond between sodium and chloride for salt, those are ions, and so the charges of the water molecule interact with the charges of the sodium and chloride, and that's why we see the dissolving of salt a little bit slower, but we still see salt dissolving. And water basically makes a barrier. If you look at that image, water makes a barrier around the select ions so that they don't form back together. Water can also dissolve things that are not polar covalent or ionic. Larger molecules like proteins and things like that can dissolve as long as they have some sort of polar region. It can be very temporary. And when you remember that, because electrons are moving all the time, we can see like slight charged areas on a non-polar compound. It's possible. The terms hydrophobic and hydrophilic, we've talked about this before, and this goes back to the endocrine system. If you remember, hydrophilic is a substance that has an affinity for water or water soluble. Hydrophobic is lipid soluble. Usually these cannot dissolve together. As long as something is hydrophilic, it can dissolve in water. Hydrophobic things like oil and fats will not. Acids, bases, and buffers. So this is kind of the tail end of talking about water. It's not super important for you to remember this for the AP Bio test, but it's useful. Water is constantly a equal combination of an acid and a base because sometimes water molecules interact to make hydrodium, which is H3O plus, and hydroxide. When you get imbalances is when you get acids and bases. Hi. I got interrupted. So if we have an imbalance is when we get acids and bases. If you remember, if I have, so this is talking about that transfer. Basically, when the changes in hydrogen or H3O increase, you're going to have an acid. If you have more OH, you're going to have a more basic solution. They are equal in water, but the change for whatever reason, or the addition of more hydrogens or hydroxides, is going to change the pH. We know the pH scale, 1 to 14, 1 being super acidic, 14 being very basic, and this stuff we should know too, right? You know what an acid is versus a base. Buffers are substances that resist changes in acidity. Basically, they either can combine and like absorb the hydrogen ions or the hydroxide ions, so we maintain the same amount and it'll keep something neutral. This is used in chemistry mostly. But something to think about, and this is also useful for the essay question that we talked about, human activities create a lot of acid. Burning fossil fuels is going to create more hydrogen released, and then it's going to combine with the water and make it acidic. That's why we get acid rain. So we also see ocean acidification because the CO2 that's created off of those plants becomes acid in the ocean as well. This is talking about how basically seawater becomes more acidic. We see the breakdown of like shells and corals and things like that. It's going to release more acid into the water, both of which are problems, right? Again, acid rain, also an issue. Just keeping these in the back of your mind for like essays when they ask like, how do humans impact water? These two obviously would be really good examples of that. Looking at acid rain examples, looking at the pH scale, you know the pH scale. So just make sure you know 1 to 14, 1 acidic, 14 basic. This is how we calculate how much, this is just, if you want, pause here if you want, but don't worry about this very much. Again, reiteration of the pH scale. I've told you what you need to know. You do not need to know in this much detail, and you should already know it from Gen Bio and Chem. And that is it for this set of slides. Make sure you know this for the quiz when you come in on Wednesday. Science! It's cool.